First, thanks for coming on this cold and dark and very rainy afternoon. A very interesting topic for discussion this afternoon on North Indian nuclear crisis, North Korean nuclear crisis, and we have Dr. Vipin Narang with us, who is Associate Professor of Political Science in MIT. Professor Narang did his PhD from the Department of Government, Harvard University, and his dissertation was just to be the best in international relations. Dr. Narang has done MS from Stanford University and MPhil from Oxford University. You did live in And the research interests of Dr. Narang are nuclear proliferation and strategy and South Asian security. North Korea has been trying to go on the nuclear path perhaps from the 1970s. 1980s, we in India were very alarmed by this nexus between North Korea and Pakistan. For the missile technology and nuclear technology, enrichment technology exchange. The world got alarmed. 1985, North Korea had signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but all indications were that it was perhaps doing all kinds of things in a clandestine manner. Then 94, North Korea and US agreement to freeze the North Korean nuclear program and dismantle their reactors. Fast forward 2003, 2002, Axis of Evil, 2003, withdrawal from NPT. Then from 2006, nuclear tests, numerous missile tests, and then President Trump comes to the White House, 2017, the war of words between the two, between the rocket man and the Totar, and then the January 2018 New Year message of Kim Jong-un and very rapidly unfolding events, Singapore summit, Hanoi, and the present stalemate. All this is known, but there are many unknowns and many questions which come to our minds when we analyze this issue. So Professor Narang will cover it from the point of how we got here and where we are going. But 3 or 4 questions I would like to pose, if Dr. Narang, if you could cover. One is that if the regime survival is the core interest of North Korea, is CVID ever possible? Complete, verifiable, irreversible disarmament. Is it just a smoke screen being pulled by Kim Jong-un, or at any point of time in future, can North Korea really agree to this? 2, what is exactly denuclearization? Is it denuclearization of North Korea or of Korean Peninsula or even environs around Korean Peninsula, including Guam, etc.? 3rd, what is the linkage between the peace treaty, peace process and denuclearization of, let us say, Korean Peninsula? Will one follow the other, as perhaps Kim Jong-un wants that the peace process should come first and denuclearization later? Americans want the reverse, and or something step by step or something in tandem with reciprocal steps have also been talked about. And of course the 4th question is that sanctions are hard, sanctions are biting North Korea. US can live with sanctions, it doesn't hurt the US. And whatever is coming from North Korea, from Pyongyang, from Kim Jong-un, is that ease the sanctions. How can that be done without some steps towards denuclearization? I think these are some of the issues on which we'll be very eagerly listening to your comments. Professor Rang, maybe 35 to 40 minutes, and then we'll let you.
I'll even keep it brief.
Oh, please, over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thanks, everybody, for coming. I just got back from a week in Goa with my kids, and I want to go back. Beautiful weather there, and coming back to this. What I thought I'd do is provide a brief context of where we are in terms of nuclear proliferation and nuclear strategy in this past year. I just had an article come out in Foreign Affairs last week, which should be available online to everybody, with my former student, now colleague Nick Miller, called The New Nuclear Era, which identified 3 characteristics of what I think is a new nuclear age emerging. And so I'll talk about that briefly and then turn specifically to North Korea, which is part and parcel of one of these 3 characteristics, which is new proliferance. So, because this is the Institute of Chinese Studies, I think it's important to talk about the first characteristic of what I think is an emerging nuclear era, new nuclear era, where 2019 is we may look back at this past year as the inflection point. And the first characteristic is great power nuclear arms competition. It's back, and it's back with a vengeance. The U.S. withdrew from the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, the INF Treaty. We can litigate whether, how the United States did it. The INF Treaty is not strictly a nuclear treaty, it's a missile treaty. But essentially, Russia was developing and testing a missile known as 9M729, which is a ground-launched intermediate-range missile, in violation of the INF Treaty since about 2012 or 2013. The Obama administration had tried to quietly pressure Russia to come back into compliance with the INF Treaty. The Trump administration, unsurprisingly, doesn't like persuasion as a strategy, and so decided to unilaterally notify Moscow of its intent to withdraw from the treaty. There was a 6-month window, which started in February, in which the U.S. tried to give Russia that time to come back into compliance. Russia chose not to, and so the U.S. then withdrew over the summer, and most recently tested its own ground-launch intermediate-range conventional missile out of Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. And the demise of the INF Treaty isn't necessarily a death knell for all nuclear arms control between the great powers, but it represents an increasing move away from an arms control regime that had been entirely about reductions up until the demise of the INF Treaty. Russia had basically decided that it was in its interest to develop ground-launch ballistic and cruise missiles for the European theater to support its offensive aims potentially in the Baltics and elsewhere. The United States decided, perhaps rightly, that what's the point of a bilateral treaty where the partner is violating the terms of the treaty, so withdrew from the treaty, but now has developed the option, and this is why I think it's important in this particular forum, to develop and deploy intermediate-range ground-launched conventional missiles, not just in Europe, but in East Asia, to counter what it views as an increasingly menacing Chinese threat of intermediate-range missiles. I mean, most of China's missiles, save the ICBMs, are in the intermediate range. So the DF-41, DF-31 are long-range ICBMs, but most of China's inventory falls in the intermediate range, and those are useful because the targets that China wants to hold at risk in a potential conflict with the United States in the Pacific theater are all in the intermediate range from the Chinese coastline or Chinese mainland. But the United States had up until now relied on air launch and sea launch missiles to counter that threat, and is now starting to explore the possibility of deploying ground launch systems. Who would host them is an open question. It's unlikely, I think, Japan or South Korea would, because they would make themselves a target. But there's Guam, there's the Philippines. There are potential options to surge ground launch systems in a crisis. But the demise of the INF Treaty is the first time, I think, that we've seen an increase in, we've had modernization programs under the caps of the arms control regimes that we've had between the U.S. and Russia. But the demise of the INF Treaty is a first step. The second step that's coming, which I think is more important, is this question about the extension of the New START Treaty. The New START Treaty caps strategic deployments between the U.S. and Russia at 1550 systems, not necessarily warheads because the accounting is a little funky. And China is outside of the New START regime and the SALT regime, et cetera, et cetera. The U.S. and Russia had seen a secular decline in the number of deployed systems since the end of the Cold War. If the United States, if President Trump is reelected, the Trump administration has said it wants to renegotiate the New START Treaty to include China. And oddly, they threw France in there, although it's unclear why France would be party to it. But China is the primary target of a multilateral successor to New START for the Trump administration. The problem being that what is China's New START number, right? The New START limits the number of deployed systems to 1550. Does anybody know how many strategic nuclear systems China deploys on a day-to-day basis? Anybody?
None.
Pretty close to zero. I'm not willing to say exactly zero, but pretty close to zero. So if you bring China into a New START regime where the cap is 1550, that's either an invitation for Beijing to sprint to parity, or you have to bring China in at a lower cap, which Beijing will never accept. So the argument in the Trump administration to bring China into a multilateral version of New START is, from my perspective, a poison pill for the extension of New START. This is an administration that does not want to extend or renegotiate the New START treaty. Which is interesting because up until now there's been a bipartisan consensus. For the footnote is that President Putin is willing to extend New START without any renegotiation, without any preconditions, if the United States does so. And it's 10 days after the inauguration of the new president, February 1st, 2021, when the decision about the extension of New START has to occur, and it can occur with the signature of the President of the United States and President Putin and no congressional ratification. So if a Democratic president is elected in November, my guess is we'll get an extension of New START, no questions asked. But if Trump is reelected, and I think that's a non-trivial possibility, if I were to bet, and we had the election 3 times, I think Trump wins twice. So I would put Trump winning this election, just the incumbency advantage, and the fact that impeachment has solidified his base. He's not going to get convicted in the Senate. The Democratic primary field is a mess. I would spitball a 2/3 probability that Trump gets reelected. So the New START Treaty, if it doesn't get extended, will be the first time that you have no arms control arrangement between the U.S. and Russia and China since the end of the Cold War. And before that, too, because you have the SALT treaties. So there's been a bipartisan consensus in the United States on the benefits of strategic arms control. Arms controllers love it because it keeps the numbers low. Counterforcers love it because it tells you exactly how many systems Russia deploys and where they are. So if the United States nuclear strategy is entirely counterforce based, we can talk about that for anybody who cares, but we have a hard kill, all of our nuclear strike options are entirely based on counterforce. We target all the strategic systems of the Soviet Union, land, air, and sea. It's the same for China, it's the same for North Korea. This idea of mutually assured destruction for legal reasons and strategic reasons in the United States have never actually existed. Our entire nuclear strike package options are based exclusively on counterforce. So if you're a counterforcer, you love New START because it tells you exactly how many strategic deployed systems Russia has and where they are, and you verify it, and you can go get them because it caps them at 1550. The only constituency that opposes arms control arrangements with Russia are the arms racers. People like John Bolton, who believe that the United States can bring Russia to its economic knees by engaging in an arms race, and that the United States is differentially suited to compete and win an arms race with Russia. And so it's a political strategy to force Russia to compete and collapse the economy. Okay. So if Trump wins re-election, there's a significant possibility that great power nuclear arms competition will be unconstrained. So that's the first feature. We have not seen multilateral nuclear arms competition or arms racing in the history of the nuclear era. The US and Soviet Union were two powers, and if they arms raced, at least it was one actor vis-a-vis one actor. If China is in the mix, for the first time we'll have three nuclear great powers essentially arms racing. The second feature, which I'll talk about before I get to North Korea, is that we are now entering a phase where nuclear powers are no longer satisfied with being constrained by adversaries with nuclear weapons. And this is where I think in India and Pakistan the events at Balakot are really important. For the first time in the nuclear era, a nuclear power parked ordnance and bombed the sovereign territory of another nuclear power. India did what no other nuclear power in the previous 70 years of the nuclear era had done. Used air power on the sovereign territory of its nuclear adversary. And that represented, I think, a watershed moment, not in calling Pakistan's nuclear bluff, etc., but this notion that nuclear powers have to be constrained against their nuclear adversaries, even when their nuclear adversaries aggress against them with subconventional action or terrorism. And this idea that once your adversary gets nuclear weapons, you can no longer retaliate against provocations is a proposition that is being tested here in South Asia, but also elsewhere. This morning, Iran launched 15 ballistic missiles at US forces in Iraq, and it seems like there were no casualties, either Iraqi or American. But here you have a non-nuclear, proto-nuclear power firing ballistic missiles at US forces in a third-party nation. Several months ago, Turkey, which hosts US nuclear weapons, in an unprecedented action, an allied nation was firing at US forces in Syria. This idea that nuclear weapons are all of a sudden a game changer and there's no longer conflict between nuclear weapons powers is a proposition that is starting to be tested and the line being pushed here in South Asia as a primary example, but elsewhere as well. States are no longer satisfied with being constrained by the nuclear weapons capabilities of their adversaries. And we're entering an era where pushing that line could potentially have catastrophic consequences. Because the assumption behind pushing the line is that you can calibrate escalation precisely, that you can see through the fog of war precisely. We don't know what happened today with this Ukrainian airliner, but it seems like this crisis, which President Trump and Foreign Minister Zarif of Iran said, oh, we'll both get our shot in, the US killed Soleimani, the Iranians retaliated, and we can all de-escalate. Well, there's a real human cost if this Ukrainian airliner was accidentally shot down by anti-aircraft artillery in Iran, which seems increasingly likely. And anybody who says they can see through the fog of war in these crises don't have potential costs. I give them Exhibit A, which is, pardon my language, shit happens. And you can imagine in the Balakot retaliation, a couple of wrong turns, and the crisis goes very, very differently. What if Abhinandan had been killed when his F-21 was fired at? What if he had died in Pakistani custody? What if Prime Minister Modi had retaliated with a missile strike, the Qatl ki Raat threat that he made, several days after Abhinandan was shot down, but still in Pakistani custody, the day after, I think? For the first time, India deployed the Arihant in the middle of a crisis and wants at least some audiences to believe that nuclear weapons were on board the Arihant. What if there had been an accident at sea? There were a lot of possibilities that end in escalation rather than de-escalation if the crisis takes one wrong turn. What if the Pakistani Air Force had accidentally hit a high-value target at the brigade headquarters instead of missing its target? What if it had hit a school or a hospital and killed more civilians? This idea that escalation is good and is necessary and is easy to win and to satisfy domestic political constituencies baying for blood is a very risky proposition. And while the ambiguity around Balakot may have helped de-escalation in this particular crisis, it sets the stage for much more escalatory action the next time around. Because if India believes that it can get its shot in without significant costs, And next time, and there will be a next time, there's a sub-conventional attack either in J&K or in the Indian homeland, and the Indian government feels like it needs to retaliate at a higher level, to retaliate for a greater harm that it perceives from Pakistan, then you may get greater retaliation from Pakistan. And this idea that you can control escalation precisely is a very dangerous proposition. But this is new terrain between nuclear powers. So that's the second feature. The third feature, which I'll spend the rest of the time on, is new proliferants. And North Korea, basically, 2019 is the year in which, well, first of all, let me talk about the others. Iran, Trump administration withdraws from the JCPOA. The final step that Iran took on uranium enrichment just the other day was not in response to Soleimani. That was going to happen anyway. When the Trump administration withdrew from the JCPOA, Iran decided essentially we're going to jog for the bomb. We're not going to sprint for the bomb. We're going to walk fast toward it and leave opportunities for the U.S. to come back to the JCPOA. But all restrictions were off uranium enrichment, and Iran is a crisis that we're going to have to deal with, and we are dealing with for, I think, the years to come. In addition to Iran and adversaries acquiring nuclear weapons or pursuing nuclear weapons, we also have allies pursuing nuclear weapons. South Korea, for all of my friends who are interested in South Korea, the U.S. demand for $5 billion a year in support costs, for cost sharing and burden sharing with South Korea is an outrageous number. It's essentially 10 times what the United States has asked the South Korean government for before. It is essentially to subsidize the U.S. presence in South Korea, and a demand that high is designed to get one answer, which is no. And that's because the president, in particular, is uncomfortable with U.S. forward deployments across the world. And if the U.S. extended deterrent commitment becomes questionable or dubious to host nations like South Korea or Japan or Germany, then these questions about whether allied governments should pursue nuclear weapons and independent deterrence comes to the front and center. Japan has a virtual deterrent. The Japanese don't talk about it because they don't need to talk about it. They have 10 tons of plutonium on their sovereign territory. They have the most advanced delivery systems already in their inventory. They have to do some rewiring of some of it. But I like to joke that a Sony PlayStation has more processing power than most modern nuclear weapons. If anybody can develop nuclear weapons, it's Japan, and they are unique in the NPT system because the amount of reprocessed fissile material they already have under their sovereign control. South Korea doesn't have the fissile material, but like I said, a Samsung smartphone is harder to develop than a nuclear weapon. And there are enrichment technologies that South Korea could easily develop, probably in secret. And it already has, unlike Japan, 60 to 70% of the public in South Korea supports an independent deterrent. Germany is asking open questions about an alternative to NATO nuclear sharing agreements, primarily France, but it is not out of the question, and there have been questions raised about a German independent deterrent. So 2019 may be the year where we look back as the inflection point where everything started to go south. Great power nuclear arms competition, nuclear weapon states pushing the line against other nuclear weapon states, and pursuing more escalatory behavior against other nuclear weapons powers on the belief and the dissatisfaction of being constrained by their adversaries' nuclear weapons. And you had an inflection point on adversaries pursuing nuclear weapons and allies thinking about nuclear weapons. And behind all of this, North Korea. Kim Jong-un is laughing all the way to the proverbial bank. Because 2019 will be the year that I think we look back, especially at the Hanoi summit, as a year where we let the last opportunity to slow down the growth of the North Korean nuclear weapons program slip by. So I'm going to spend the rest of the time in North Korea and hopefully answer some of these questions. So how did we... Let me start with three propositions. One, as long as Kim Jong-un is in power, North Korea is not going to give up its nuclear weapons. The only state that has ever given up its nuclear weapons after developing them is South Africa. And South Africa did so very honestly because the white apartheid South African government saw the writing on the wall and was unwilling to bequeath nuclear weapons to a black ANC government. That is not going to happen in North Korea. So the domestic political compulsions that have led to disarmament in the past, there's only been one case, South Africa, are so far afield from what North Korea will experience or can't experience that it's essentially, out of the question. The second reason is Kim Jong-un sees what happened to Gaddafi. He sees what happens now to Iran. He sees what happened to Saddam Hussein. All three states cut a deal with the United States and met the business end of U.S. military power and the end of the regime or kinetic power, from the U.S. So if you're Kim Jong-un, you think it is good to be a nuclear weapons power. Why am I going to give up my nuclear weapons for regime survival? Kim Jong-chol is not going to face a drone strike from the United States because North Korea essentially is a nuclear weapons power. And Iran, Soleimani met the fate of what a non-nuclear weapons power means from the United States. So Kim Jong-un is not going to give up his nuclear weapons power, his nuclear weapons voluntarily. Two, taking away Kim Jong-un's nuclear weapons with a counterforce strike is too risky. It is not out of the question for a president who believes that missile defenses work and that the United States, if he's told, can find and destroy all of North Korea's nuclear weapons. I can see how he could stumble into a scenario in a crisis, in a deep crisis, where he tries to take out North Korea's nuclear weapons. But when the Obama administration did this assessment, they came to the conclusion that the U.S. could destroy 80% of the known nuclear weapons capabilities in North Korea. That meant 20% of what they knew would not be hit, and the unknown capabilities would remain in reserve to be used in retaliation against U.S. forces, against South Korea, against Japan, perhaps the U.S. homeland. So a counterforce strike that takes away North Korea's nuclear weapons by force, which is what John Bolton and Lindsey Graham's preferred option is in my view out of the question. So the only door left to push on with North Korea is to slow down the growth of the program. The idea that there may be systems, there may be caps on the number of warheads and the fissile material that Kim Jong-un may put on his force in exchange for sanctions relief. That is mutually beneficial. And that is the door I think we should be pushing on. I've been advocating for 2 years. Not going to get rid of them, so at least slow down the growth of the program. Well, so how did we get here? Okay, so that's the top line on North Korea. 2017, as everyone remembers, was the year that North Korea became a full-fledged nuclear weapons power. It had been able to hold at risk regional targets for some time. But 2017, the year that Donald Trump was inaugurated as president, was the year that North Korea became a nuclear weapons power that could plausibly hold the United States at risk. The Hwasong-14 test on July 4th, 2017 was a watershed moment in North Korea's nuclear development program. Hats off to the North Korean missileers. They have developed a whole suite of capabilities from the short to the long range. They have a liquid fuel ICBM, the Hwasong-14, and then the Hwasong-15, which was then tested November 29th, 2017, which can almost certainly hold every target in the United States at risk. It's a liquid fuel missile, and Kim Jong-un has provided basically the blueprint for a state that wants to be a nuclear weapons power and how to do it. You have to let everybody thought dictators will fail. Saddam Hussein failed, Gaddafi failed, because dictators can't manage these kinds of programs. Jacques Hyman's wrote a book on this, that dictators are unable to get their programs right because they expect fast results and don't let their scientists fail. The brilliance of Kim Jong-un's program is he allowed his scientists to fail. The only tests that are failures are those that the scientists don't learn from. So for every Musadan test or Hwasong-12 test that failed, Kim Jong-un didn't execute his missileers. He let them learn from those failed tests. And what happened, he had a Hwasong-14 program and a Hwasong-15 program that converged around the same time with success. And they were learning not only from their Soviet and Russian mentors, the Ukrainian engine designs that they've gotten and been able to almost certainly produce at home, but he's allowed the program to succeed by allowing the scientists to fail. And that's a really important, insightful point about why North Korea has been able technically to get where it's gotten. So 2017 are the ICBM tests, and then obviously September is a purported thermonuclear test. U.S. estimates now put it at about 150 to 200 kilotons, which for a 6 nuclear test is a pretty remarkable feat for a country. Maybe it's a boosted fission device, but I think the consensus is this is almost certainly a 2-stage thermonuclear device that North Korea's been able to develop. And after that, the the United States military and you'll have lawmakers say, well, we're not sure North Korea can reliably deliver a nuclear weapon against the US homeland. But nuclear deterrence is in the eye of the beholder, right? So you don't need reliable capability, you need plausible capability. And I asked a political decision maker, would any president, including President Trump, risk a 10% chance of losing Los Angeles in a war with North Korea? And I think the answer has to be no. And 200 kilotons is a language all of its own, and it's a universal language. It doesn't have to be an accurate ICBM. It doesn't have to be a reliable ICBM. But even a 10 to 30% chance that you lose half of Los Angeles gives decision makers a moment of pause. And at that point, Kim Jong-un knew that he had won the political or psychological deterrence game, which is why in the New Year's Day address on January 2018, a year after he said this is the year we're going to perfect our nuclear deterrent, Kim Jong-un says we have perfected our nuclear deterrent and we are going to mass produce our nuclear weapons capabilities for deployment and operational readiness. And thus begat the Charm Offensive. It was shortly after the thermonuclear weapons test, the Hwasong 15 test, and the New Year's Day address, when he ordered mass production, that Kim Jong-un basically reached out and said, okay, now I'm ready to talk. He sends his sister to the Pyeongchang Olympics. The inter-Korean process leads to the Singapore summit. At the Singapore summit, there was this misnomer, and we identified it from day one, that Kim Jong-un was going to give up his nuclear weapons program. He was not. He got the red carpet treatment at Singapore, what I call summit pageantry, to ratify his position as a legitimate nuclear weapons power. The reason why Kim Jong-un went there was to get sanctions relief and recognition from the President of the United States. And he did what his father and grandfather could not do before him, which is get a meeting with the President of the United States at a resort in Singapore with red carpet treatment. And if you look at the Singapore Summit Declaration, the language is very clear, and it's very, very obvious that the North Koreans stonewalled on working level negotiations until the very last minute and presented language as a fait accompli to the U.S. negotiating team, which at that point had no option but to accept it because President Trump was in the air to Singapore. And the sequence of commitments in the Singapore Declaration is really, really important. Remember, the Singapore Declaration is not a treaty. It is not an agreement. It is an outline and a roadmap with 3 points: trust building, peace treaty, complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And then the 4th point was added by the United States: return of POW and MIA returns. That was added by the United States. North Korea says, fine, no problem, boss, I can do that. And they started the process. But the language on the 3rd point is really important. The complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, to answer the ambassador's question, is vague by design. It has holes big enough to drive an ICBM through, right? And that was important because you had to get agreement from both sides. And that language, it let President Trump and Secretary Pompeo go back to the Senate and say, Kim Jong-un agreed to disarmament. And it let Kim Jong-un go back to Kim Young-chol and his hardliners and say, I have agreed to give up my nuclear weapons when everybody else does. Or when the United States gets the hell off the Korean Peninsula, when we have a peace treaty and a peace regime, and gets all of its strategic assets out of the region. At which point, we won't need nuclear weapons because we have entered an alternative universe. So Kim Jong-un basically goes home and says, I've committed to nothing. And it was very obvious after Singapore that the disagreement or lack of clarity on the definition of denuclearization, which was a virtue at Singapore, would become a problem thereafter. And the North Koreans and the Americans to this day did not agree on a common definition of denuclearization. And the problem with the lead up then to the Hanoi summit in February of this year, exactly the same day actually as the Balakot retaliation, February 26, 27, 28, essentially the same week, was that the working level groups never got off the ground. And there was never an agreed upon definition of denuclearization. And President Trump's mistake was going to Hanoi and agreeing to and pushing for a second summit without getting a deliverable ahead of time. And so Kim Jong-un was led to believe by President Trump's tweets, statements, and rhetoric about, I'm okay with short-range tests, I'm okay with this, that, and the other. Kim Jong-un would have been forgiven to believe that he was going to Hanoi to ratify the fiction of disarmament. And that Hanoi was going to be the moment where President Trump basically ratified North Korea as a normal, legitimate nuclear weapons power. Because everything President Trump, up to that point, was saying suggested that he was going to go there and offer a peace treaty or a peace declaration, which is just a piece of paper, and maybe some sanctions relief in exchange for some limits or caps on North Korea's nuclear weapons program. A deal we all thought was actually pretty good if we could get it. And the president shows up with maximalist demands, demanding what the South Koreans refer to as Yongbyon plus Alpha. North Korea has declared 300, somebody will know the exact numbers, 390 something facilities at Yongbyon as the only component of its nuclear weapons program. There's the reactor, there's the IRT, and there's uranium enrichment at Yongbyon, but we know that there are secret facilities outside of Yongbyon for uranium enrichment. So the disagreement about what was going to be on offer was already going to be a problem. The lack of agreed upon definition of denuclearization, which does not mean disarmament, was a problem well before Hanoi, but it came to a head at Hanoi. And there are two big problems about an agreement on slowing down the growth of North Korea's nuclear weapons program. One is the scope. What is going to be on the table? So Kim Jong-un, it turns out at Hanoi, from participants there, agreed at the end to put all of Yongbyon on the table. I would have taken that. That's all of North Korea's known plutonium production capability, some non-trivial portion of its uranium enrichment, and a lot of other facilities that support the development of ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons. It isn't everything, but it starves the program of plutonium, and that alone shapes the composition of the future force. But President Trump, so there's disagreement about scope, the scope of the program already. Kim Jong-un says, you can have Yongbyon. President Trump says, I want all of it, the whole enchilada, Yongbyon plus Alpha. Kim Jong-un says, I don't even acknowledge these sites. I don't know what you're talking about. So there's disagreement about scope. There was also disagreement about sequencing. And this is a point that doesn't get enough attention. Even if President Trump had agreed to just Yongbyon, which I would have taken, there was going to be disagreement about who goes first. The United States would have rightly said, we have litigated Yongbyon twice before. I'll never forget Christian Amanpour in 2006 standing on CNN saying, piece of our time as the cooling tower at the Yongbyon reactor came crashing down, only to have the cooling system rerouted through the river. And there was the agreed framework, obviously, in 1994. So the United States could have been forgiven for saying, we've litigated this twice before, you go first. I'm going to pour concrete in your damn reactor before you get any sanctions relief. That would have been perfectly reasonable, and I think that's what the U.S. would have demanded, but Kim Jong-un would have said, no way. I have closed the Sohae site reversibly. I have shuttered the nuclear test entrances at Punggye-ri. I've taken my denuclearization steps, so I want sanctions relief now. And the U.S. would have said, no way. You have to go first. The sequencing problem would have bedeviled any agreement, even if we had a scoping, common understanding of the scoping of what would be on the table. But there are ways around that. We learned from the Iran deal that snapback provisions are a really powerful way to give sanctions relief with the possibility of reimposing sanctions very quickly if the counterparty is deemed to be in violation of the agreement. So some sort of sanctions relief over time, a deal that is comprehensive in scope but implemented in a step-by-step phased manner, is what should have come out of Hanoi. and everything was ripe for an agreement at Hanoi, for a comprehensive deal that had denuclear disarmament as the rhetorical end goal, because the U.S. can't give that up, but accepts essentially that North Korea will keep the bulk of its nuclear weapons, its missiles, but will slow down the growth of it by starving it of fissile material, and perhaps putting caps eventually on the number of nuclear weapons and diversity of systems that North Korea develops. But we didn't get there because both sides stuck to their maximalist demands. Kim Jong-un wanted all of the sanctions relief up front. President Trump said, no, I want all of the nuclear weapons program up front, and the zone of overlap was non-existent. So both walked away from Hanoi very upset. Kim Jong-un went there legitimately thinking that President Trump was going to ratify the fiction of disarmament and recognize him as a legitimate normal nuclear weapons power, and he'd staked a lot of his internal legitimacy on that. And so Kim Jong-un went silent. Probably because he and the hardliners at home were shocked at how President Trump showed up with his maximalist demands and didn't walk away from them, because nothing President Trump said publicly, and my sense is privately, would have led Kim Jong-un to believe that President Trump would show up and demand everything without sanctions relief on offer or a peace treaty or something else in return. And maybe President Trump was distracted by the Michael Cohen testimony at home and some domestic political distractions. But Hanoi, we may look back at Hanoi and the Yongbyon offer and the inability to get the scoping and sequencing right as a last chance to slow down the growth of the nuclear program in North Korea with a lot of regret. Because after that, Kim Jong-un went dark. And there was a lot, it seems to be a lot of internal debate within North Korea about how to proceed with the United States after the failure at Hanoi. Kim Jong-un almost certainly felt humiliated and had to answer our hardliners back home about having put so much on the stake with this diplomatic process with President Trump and coming back empty-handed. So then we hear about this end-of-year deadline. That North Korea was going to give the United States until December 31st. We think December 31st. I don't know what the new year actually is. Maybe it's, when is the North Korean New Year? January 20th? 26th? It's at the end of this month, and his birthday is coming up. There's an end-of-year deadline for the United States to change its so-called calculation, particularly on sanctions relief, but maybe also a security guarantee. But they went dark, and President Trump made a historic visit then to Panmunjom in July of 2019, sorry. First U.S. president to set foot in North Korea. And that was, he had to go there to pick up the lost ground from Hanoi. For analysts who celebrated Panmunjom as progress in the diplomatic process were misreading the situation. President Trump had to go to Panmunjom to get the working level talks out of a coma and pick up the ground that was lost after Hanoi. For anybody who's a U.S. football fan, we call it picking up the 15 yards you lost on the penalty you took at Hanoi. That was just to get back to zero. And after that, the hope was that working level talks would start, and they never did. Not until, what, November? Right? The Stockholm meeting, where at which point North Korea said denuclearization is off the table, and there was no movement at Stockholm. All the while, North Korea's been testing a whole bunch of short-range solid fuel missiles, which are really scary. The KN-23 missile is solid fuel, it's fast, it has a low trajectory to evade missile defenses, and it can maneuver in flight. This is a nightmare for South Korea and U.S. forces on the peninsula. And President Trump puts his head in the sand about how these are just short-range missile tests. But a lot of these technologies, solid fuel, maneuverability, responsiveness, mobility, are going to find themselves in the long-range systems that North Korea has been working on all this time. North Korea never said it was going to stop producing nuclear weapons. The 2018 New Year's Day speech dictum stands. It never said it was going to stop producing ballistic missiles. All the while, it has been improving and expanding its arsenal through this process. Without a written agreement after Hanoi to slow it down, North Korea has continued to do exactly what it said it was going to do, which is improve and expand its force. And now, with the failure of the diplomatic process as far as North Korea is concerned, Kim Jong-un has promised a new strategic system. We don't know what this new strategic system is. There are many guesses. It could be a new variant of the Hwasong 14 or 15. It could be a solid fuel system. It could be a brand new ICBM altogether. It could be a new submarine-launched ballistic missile. It could be an improved re-entry vehicle. We don't know. But Kim Jong-un has almost certainly taken a lot of delight in all of the hysteria he created with the so-called Christmas gift, which never came. And he's biding his time. The Iran crisis now has given Kim Jong-un an opportunity to lay low. What's the Sun Tzu saying? Never interrupt your enemy while he's making a mistake. And so Kim Jong-un can sit back and test the system whenever he wants, because time is on his side. For every day that passes without an agreement, like Hanoi, Kim Jong-un gets stronger. Because America's maximum pressure campaign has no air left in it. There's no pressure left in the campaign because China and Russia have essentially undermined it. I don't know the statistics. They're hard to come by. Cross-border trade, energy trade. Because from China and Russia's perspective, Kim Jong-un has actually done everything he said he was going to do. So there's no justification for continuing with the maximum pressure campaign. And so the U.S. is out on a limb trying to enforce a maximum pressure campaign when there are leaks the size of ICBMs in the tires. So without a sustainable maximum pressure campaign, and an ability to continue to produce nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, time is on North Korea's side. And certainly Kim Jong-un would love official sanctions relief, but he doesn't need it desperately, particularly as he is continuing to improve and expand his nuclear weapons force. So I think we will look back in 2019 as the year that we let the North Korean nuclear program become a monster, because we didn't have the bandwidth and the foresight to slow it down when we could. Because now getting Kim Jong-un back to the table is much harder because he has more leverage as every day passes. So my proposed solution, and my co-authors Ankit Panda, Nick Miller, all of us have been basically saying disarmament is a door that was slammed shut a long time ago. The door we need to be pushing on is arms control with North Korea to cap the program, slow the program. You can say get rid of the program, but they're never going to do it. But preventing this program from becoming a monster is in global security interest. So North Korea doesn't sell technology to Pakistan, to Iran, to Syria, so that it doesn't have a loose nukes problem if there's ever a domestic political implosion in North Korea. We do not want North Korea run amok with nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, because if it ever comes a time when they need hard cash, they're willing buyers. The KN-23 is a missile that I think a lot of states would be very, very interested in buying. And North Korea has that leverage, and we haven't talked enough about the leverage it gets by displaying these systems to missile-poor countries who may want to buy that technology. And if there's ever a North Korean collapse, you don't want the country run awash with nuclear weapons that you then have to secure. It is in everybody's interest to slow down the growth of this program. And we let the opportunity slip by in Hanoi. And I don't know whether we'll get it back again. So with that, I'll close, and I look forward to questions, comments, etc., anything, on any topic.
Fascinating presentation from Dr. Narang, and very, very thought-provoking also. Before I floor for Q&A, one query about the elephant in the room, China. Really, in anything happening in Korean Peninsula, North Korea, there are really four players, not only United States and North Korea, but South Korea as well as China are very deeply, intimately involved. South Korea's position is very clear, and where they stand, they're practically a mediator now between the United States and North Korea. But China lost 400,000 people in the Korean War.
Yep.
So they have a stake. What, in your view, are the Chinese red lines, or how does China look at the end game on the Korean Peninsula?
And I forgot, this is the Institute for Chinese Studies, I forgot the China view. So China's interest, this is my view, based on strategic logic, but also discussions with Chinese counterparts every now and then in these track twos. China also doesn't want North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons. North Korea is a valuable buffer between Western forces and China. And China has always had a relaxed view of nuclear proliferation. My sense is China fears desperate, poor North Korea at the risk of collapse more than it fears nuclear North Korea. They believe, because the Chinese view of nuclear weapons is that they are caution-inducing, they help proliferate Pakistan, they themselves believe that they are very restrained, responsible nuclear weapons power. They do not view nuclear North Korea as a threat to global security in the way that I think the US views nuclear North Korea. So China prefers a nuclear North Korea to a poor, desperate North Korea that is a risk of collapse, which is also why it has every incentive to undermine the maximum pressure campaign. A stable nuclear North Korea is actually, I think, in China's geostrategic interest. So the red lines for China, I think, are they are okay with missile testing. Short-range missile tests, no problem. There may be some concern about ICBM tests, especially those that overfly Japan, just because they create diplomatic headaches. But the real red line, I think, is nuclear testing. I think China has basically intimated to Kim Jong-un, okay, congratulations, you got your thermonuclear test in, no more. Because nuclear testing, I think, creates a problem for China. So missile tests, I think there's a tolerance for it from the Chinese. There may be some discomfort with ICBM tests, but probably not too much. But the red line is a nuclear test. So at this point, I think going forward, I would be surprised if North Korea reopens nuclear testing, unless there's a real break from China. And the other thing I think that China has to be wary of is, one of the reasons at the back of their mind why they have to be concerned why Kim Jong-un got nuclear weapons was also to generate distance between Pyongyang and Beijing and allow North Korea to run an independent foreign policy. And there is probably some concern about how far afield Kim Jong-un might get as an independent actor in the peninsula. So their preference is a Kim Jong-un they can control, that is loyal to Beijing. And if Kim Jong-un starts running an independent foreign policy to the consternation of Beijing, then I think their calculation might change. I don't think we're there yet. And also, South Korea's interests are actually quite aligned with this, with China, in the sense that South Korea's largest trading partner by far is China. And I think there's a world in which South Korea would be okay with, if there is a peace regime, even with nuclear North Korea. If the US left South Korea, I think there is a world in which, particularly a liberal South Korean government, would be happy to realign with China. And the US security architecture already is so complicated in East Asia because Japan and South Korea is a broken link. And it may inevitably end up being that South Korea goes to the Chinese orbit also.
Floor is now open for questions. Ambassador Yogin Kumar.
Thank you. Perhaps it's a question come comment, but I have another question, also two questions. One is that, as your last comment, how do we embed this in a larger strategic security architecture in East Asia and now perhaps Southeast Asia, which will involve Russia as well, and Russia is now getting hyperactive on the East Asia side. So I'm just wondering how the US actually is playing, or what is its perspective as to how this security architecture needs to evolve given the current realities. The second point actually is more related to, because you mentioned about Iran and so on and so forth. I mean, we've watched President Trump for about already more than 2 years, and you said there's a possibility of him getting re-elected, a possibility. How do you measure or assess his negotiating style? Because my sense I'm getting is that, of course, he has emboldened DPRK, and the current developments taking place in Iraq also is a sign that Iran also is getting bolder, because of which this escalation has taken place. So I'm just wondering, when you link up to the entire arc, Iraq, Iran, Gulf, Afghanistan, and North Korea, I'm just wondering, a bit of a crystal gazing perhaps as to the effect of Trump's negotiating style on the listed global security order.
Let's do one by one. I think those questions are related, actually. I think because one thing about Trump, which I think is clear, is that his instinct is to get the U.S. out of it. out of a lot of areas that there has been previously bipartisan consensus about the value of allies in the U.S. extended, for deployment extended terms commitments, including East Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. And I think his negotiating style is to break a lot of China and bring out to the public or on Twitter what was previously private. We've had burden sharing and cost sharing negotiations with all our allies till the kingdom come, but they never spilled out to the open because we didn't want to embarrass our friends. And we didn't want to put public pressure on our friends about how much, when you're splitting the bill at dinner, right? The value of friendship is something, he views everything as transactional. And in some ways that gives him leverage. Because if the allies are scared that he'll actually leave, he thinks that maybe they'll pony up these exorbitant amounts for cost sharing and burden sharing in East Asia, or in Iran's case, the fear of U.S. military strikes will be so great that here you have a madman strategy that'll bring them to the negotiating table. So there is a kind of a rationalist view of it, but what I see in the U.S. is actually a lot of dysfunction and a president who throws a lot of different signals out at once, and not intentionally so. But there isn't a core strategic logic as to how he's approaching these negotiations, and that has a real cost to how the U.S. is approaching East Asia. And this is your first question. Geopolitically, China is playing three-dimensional chess here, and has a long-term strategy to essentially displace the United States from the Pacific theater. And in a lot of ways, they have a president who's actually willing to play ball with them, because you have a national defense strategy written, which could have been written by any Republican or Democratic administration, right? We had the rebalance to Asia, the pivot. China needs to be the focus. But you have a president that doesn't have the bandwidth for it, or the investment in it. And so we don't have a coherent East Asia strategy right now. We're shaking down our allies, while at the same time paying lip service to the idea that we need to strategically compete with China and Russia. China and Russia have essentially undermined the U.S. strategy with North Korea because of, it's taken the air out of the maximum pressure campaign. And we have not reoriented our forces towards East Asia because we're about to get involved with another Middle East conflict. So there hasn't been this ruthless strategic logic that you would expect of a coherent, competent foreign policy team, because it's so thin. And President Trump, this is his style. He thinks that things are wasted. It's transactional for him. He views everything through the ledger book. Why do I need to have all these assistant secretaries and undersecretaries and this? I don't need all of that. I know exactly what I want with the trade deals. I want, to me, Japan, I don't see Japan as a valuable ally in East Asia. I see it as somebody who's abused me in trade deals. I see South Korea as taking advantage of the fact that I'm providing their defense. I see India as somebody who's taking advantage of trade deals, and he wakes up and thinks about Harley Davidsons. So this is a president who moves all over the place. It's very difficult to engage that kind of president. And it's tempting to say there's an underlying strategic logic. But in the U.S., as analysts, it's very difficult to see that. What we see is a lot of discombobulation and ad hocery. And that's no way to run a superpower.
Mr. Quick follow. In terms of strategy, the negotiating strategy, from what I gather, my sense is that Trump's negotiating style or psychology somehow has not found an institutional manifestation.
Right.
It's purely second-guessing everybody. The other thing, of course, is that because of the fact that people have made the assessment, I think so, all of the adversaries, including allies, that he is not going to, comes close to the brink, but then walks back. And that is why the allies and adversaries then come together to calm things down, to see that China doesn't get broken any further. But in the process, what actually happens is, as we discussed, that, whether it's DPRK or whether it is Iran or Taliban for that matter, or Pakistan, they feel that they have found more space to do what they're doing. And that's why perhaps in one way the unknowns are uncertain. I don't know whether Trump's second term of Trump might become a little more institutional, more logical. I don't know.
Well, there's also there was a view before last week that President Trump was actually reluctant to use military force. Remember, he publicly refused to retaliate after Iran hit the ship, right, in the Straits of Hormuz. And I think two things have happened. One, he bristled at the criticism after that, in particular, that he was weak. And two, as an impeached president, there is a psychological incentive to recapture the few things the president can actually do, and use of force is one of them. And I think he overshot with the Soleimani attack. He opened up this huge Pandora's box, this norm that we don't engage in political assassination. Let's call it what it was. It wasn't about this idea of reestablishing deterrence. It was decapitation. This was a major general of the Quds Force in the IRGC, a uniformed officer of a sovereign state in a diplomatic flag car in a third-party state that is hosting your forces.
But he was being very aggressive. Soleimani being very aggressive.
All of that is. No one is denying. Far be it from me, Soleimani is a bastard, and he has killed a lot of Americans, Iraqis, no question. But he's a member of a foreign government. Now you've opened a Pandora, and the concern is consequentialist for me. Not that he may have deserved what he got, but now U.S. diplomats, servicemen, military officers, senators, presidents, vice presidents, open season, right? You now open this precedent, and I'm not sure it was thought through. And so there's this risk that he went from completely restrained to unleashed because he's trying to recapture some power of the presidency. And I think there's something to that.
I have several questions. My first is about what you mentioned about, say, proliferation in Japan and South Korea. As the rhetoric increases about $5 billion a year and so on, do you think they would indulge in more hedging or posturing to get the US back? Or do you think they would only wait until their faith in extended deterrence fails completely and then just sprint to a nuclear weapon? And if and when they do you think it would be, as you said earlier, a catalytic nuclear posture, or would it be something a little more independent? My second question is about, as you rightly said, new start, like the question of China coming into a new start like really doesn't arise. But what do you think the carrots and the sticks could be for them acceding to some kind of trilateral or maybe even a multilateral missile regime? For instance, the thing that they're most scared of, say missile defense, would the US be open to giving up missile defense stuff? So what would be the carrots and the sticks in that scenario? Thirdly, considering what I said, the fear of missile defense and precision strikes and all, do you think there is a real possibility of China moving towards putting the warheads on alert, launch and warning? And how, if they do, how far down the line those capabilities become operational and even, operational completely, basically? Yeah.
Good questions. Okay, so Japan and South Korea, at some point, if you develop a hedge, there's a decision point about whether, I think the idea is more catalytic initially, maybe not with Trump, but at least, with the US in general. Japan has made noises about this since the 50s, right? And it has always been to elicit greater reassurance. But if that reassurance isn't forthcoming, you at least have the technical hedge to go your own way if you need to. And it would not shock me if Japan has quietly thought about what that would take and what it would look like and how long it would take. It wouldn't shock me if quietly South Korea has also thought about timelines for what would it take. What can you do? Remember, the indicators start lighting up on a nuclear weapons program the closer you get to a bomb. You can do a lot to lay the groundwork in secret without a lot of alarm bells going off. And it wouldn't shock me. Japan has already done it. South Korea is also doing it. European partners, I think there isn't a lot of appetite in Germany for it, but you hear these fringe voices every now and then, and some of that's intentional. So it depends. I think they would prefer a world in which they rely on the U.S. extended deterrence commitment. But in developing a hedge, they're giving themselves optionality, and it depends, I think, on the U.S. If Trump is reelected and starts thinking about really breaking alliances and reorienting U.S. policy. And I think there'll be strong resistance within the military. The Pentagon really does not, these are lily pads for the U.S., right? This is all strategically beneficial for the United States. So I don't think we're there yet, but I think there are certainly, I wouldn't be surprised if there are quiet moves to think about what a hedge would look like. China knew, some sort of missile arms control regime in exchange for missile defense. I don't know that there's any appetite on either side for it. I don't know if the U.S. will limit national missile defense. The MDR is pretty clear about who the target of missile defense is, our national GBIs and national missile defense, and it includes Russia and China. A future administration might come, I'm talking mostly, I think, about this administration. I could see a Warren administration agreeing to some limits on it. I mean, I've always thought the threat to deploy ground launch systems itself maybe leverage, right? This is the old Kissinger strategy. You build it up to trade it away. It's possible, but I think China has such an overwhelming geographic and numerical advantage with the INF missiles it has, that it would be difficult for them to really, why would they come to the table, right? The third question is interesting, and one we thought a lot about. I think inevitably, once you go to canisterized systems, especially on land and sea, particularly in SSBN, you have to start thinking about what a fully mated system looks like. And SSBN, by definition, goes out to sea with warheads on it. The question is when you send your SSBN out. You don't want to get in the business of having to load warheads in a crisis, because you're very vulnerable when you do that, right? Which is why everybody talks about the bastion model that the Soviets had, but the Soviets had huge sanctuaries in the North Sea, like in Siberia. Like, it was invulnerable. The Chinese coast, where you would be loading the SSBNs, is quite vulnerable, right? It would be a sitting duck. It's the same problem India has, by the way, right? There are only two places you could possibly, two or three you could load the missiles on the SSBNs, and they're very vulnerable. The idea of a bastion model only works if you're the damn Soviet Union with this huge northern coastline that is completely invulnerable. So this question will come for both the Chinese and the Indians. What kind of deterrent patrol model do you adopt? If it's punctuated and you only do it in a crisis, then you take the hit that you're going to be vulnerable as you load the SSBN. But if you do continuous deterrent patrol, you're giving your adversary a chance to do ASW and track and detect your SSBNs. But once you go out, you've got a fully mated system. So China, I think, there will be some model where they envision doing that. And once you do it at sea, then there's a temptation to do it on land also, right? And, the DF-41, you're starting to talk about very big missiles and very big warheads. Again, you don't want to be in the business of having to load these things in a crisis when they're very, very vulnerable. So it wouldn't be surprising to me if eventually China just goes down the route of, I think India's already going there. I think the strategic planners here have figured out that you don't want to be in the business of doing this in a crisis. And it's actually smarter to have a ready system so you train people how to manage them during peacetime so that when the crisis comes, it's not the first time you're holding a nuclear weapon or a nuclear system. Right? So I actually think it's smarter to do it for a variety of reasons. And as long as your negative controls are sophisticated and secure enough, it's not that big a deal. But China will get there.
Yeah, thank you. I have a simple question that how you rate the new Russian missile, hypersonic missile, and do you see possibly a chance?
Avant-garde, you mean?
Yeah, and how it is going to figure in the start, if at all, renewed?
Well, I mean, none of this is new. The hysteria over avant-garde. First of all, it's slower than a normal ICBM reentry vehicle. ICBM RVs already enter at hypersonic speeds. We've already had maneuverable warheads forever and a day. So what is avant-garde? Okay, it flies lower. It is a different type of challenge, but it is not a new challenge. What it does is add to the diversity of potential penetration capabilities that the Russians have. But it's not a game changer. Hypersonics is one of these new sexy things in Washington. What they want, the funders game in Washington is pick your new sexy thing, sell it as a terrible, new threat and get money to study it. But it's really, it's an old, what's the saying, an old pig in new clothes, or I don't know what the saying is, something like that. Old new wine, exactly, right? Old wine in a new bottle, that's it. I don't know where this pig came from. Right, so I don't think Russian, Chinese hypersonics in and of themselves are new technologies, but it's the numbers. Stalin's saying is actually true. Quantity has a quality all of its own. And what we're getting to, both with the North Koreans, short-range systems, the Chinese and the Russian systems, is the numbers of maneuverable systems and the diversity of altitudes and apogees that you have to deal with. That's the problem, right? And it's putting pressure on a limited missile defense system. But everybody foresaw this. With missile defense, the problem is that the offense has the advantage. It is cheaper to develop these and deploy more dummy decoys or maneuverable warheads than it is to develop more GPIs. So at the end of the day, missile defense is driving this, but none of this is actually really new. James Acton has a great report on this at Carnegie, my colleague and friend. He's a physicist by training from Cambridge. He's brilliant. And he just takes the air out of this new hysteria on hypersonics. A very good report.
Mike.
I served in North Korea over 20 years ago, but at that time the fear was on North Korea selling its technology, which they did in missiles. Now you say they have a very super missile technology. What are the chances of they selling it to, say, for example, the Iranians? And also their fear at that time was net chemical. In all discussions on nuclear things, these chemical weapons get lost. So they were at that time also developing chemical. Can you provide some?
Yeah, let me go, just take them backwards. Chemical weapons to me are a very localized threat. They're not very useful for, putting on ballistic missiles that enter the exo-atmosphere. Because reentry vehicles get so hot, then shielding the chemical weapons, it's possible, but why would you waste a reentry vehicle on chemical weapons? Chemical weapons are for war on the Korean Peninsula. And for me, nuclear weapons are the true weapon of mass destruction. If they ever get biological weapons right, biological weapons will be a weapon of mass destruction. Chemical weapons to me are we put them in the category because it's very useful for the major powers to put moral opprobrium on chemical weapons because they don't want them used on them. Understand that, right? That's a logic where nobody wants chemical weapons used in a theater, and so we've basically made them taboo. But they are a very localized threat. And North Korea can do as much damage with the artillery they have against Seoul than chemical. Why use chemical weapons, right? First question is really interesting, and something, since Kim Jong-un has come to power, I am not privy to any sort of national intelligence on from any country, but it seems to me Kim Jong-un has not, take that back, there's the Syria reactor. The Syria reactor is interesting because here you had two possibilities. North Korea was basically building a replica of the Yongbyon reactor in Syria before the Israelis bombed it. It was prior to Kim Jong-un, right? Kim Jong-un, this was Kim Jong-il, right? His father. Either as a backup to Yongbyon or for a Syrian nuclear weapons program, or both. That's really concerning, no question. And then you have the Iranian ballistic missiles, and that technology comes via North Korea. It's unclear whether there's centrifuge technology sharing between the two. We don't know what's happening between North Korea and Pakistan. But we haven't heard much since Kim Jong-un came to power about sharing technology. Of course, yeah. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if there's basic technology. The Iranians are witness to tests, get data from tests, but outright transfer of missiles and technology and hardware. I wonder. I don't know. I'm speculating. Maybe Kim Jong-un has decided it makes him a bigger target, right? If you start selling this stuff to Iran, Syria, then you might risk your regime, right? But as he has nuclear weapons, maybe he becomes more emboldened. It's a possibility. I will say that these weapons are really, really, really attractive. The KN-23 is a hell of a missile. It looks like an Iskander. It flies a little bit like an Iskander, but it is, if the Russians won't sell it, well, the North Koreans, it's entirely plausible. I think this is something we always have to keep an eye out for. And if you make the North Korean regime really desperate or piss them off just enough, that is always leverage they have. We can sell this stuff. And there are going to be plenty of buyers. I'd be the first in line. I'd love to put one in my backyard. The KN-23 is a pretty cool missile.
Sir, do you ever thought of that there will be?
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Do you ever thought of that there will be definitely a nuclear war as a kind of third world war? Do you believe this?
I mean, we all have to die someday. It's possible. I spent my entire academic career trying to avoid that. I think there are a lot of risks in the system. I think there are risks today in January 2020 that did not exist 2 years ago. And that's a rapid change from Obama's 2009 proxy, where, it was, call it wishful thinking, etc., but the idea that the U.S. would work to reduce the salience of nuclear weapons in its own arsenal and in the world. Or, we've done a 180 since then. It only took a decade.
We see no more.
How worried is Washington about the nuclear situation in South Asia? And how many years more it would take for America to really get worried about the Pakistani nuclear weapons, as it is worried about the Iranians and the North Koreans?
Well, I mean, the reality, does anyone remember what U.S. policy towards India and Pakistan's nuclear weapons were in 1998 after they tested? The phrase, it's very familiar to anybody who says North Korea. Cap, roll back, eliminate. And we're 0 for 3 with both countries. India and Pakistan are de facto nuclear weapons powers. They are not going away. We worry a lot about the Pakistani nuclear weapons security and surety and safety. There are worries about India's too. There's the dialogue between the U.S. and India on nuclear weapons is broken, as far as I know, because India doesn't want to have that conversation, and that's the sovereign right of India not to have that conversation. Okay. Anytime Washington gets scared about South Asia, though, India and Pakistan react and say, "Why are you scared? We'll be fine. We've had nuclear weapons in some form or another for 40 years? Since the mid-1980s, right?" So, is it there's a Delhi and Islamabad react. They bristle if the U.S. gets concerned, but it is still part and parcel of the Pakistani playbook to get the U.S. involved as soon as there's a crisis. So, U.S. concern is a double-edged sword. There are many of us in the U.S. who are concerned by Balakot and the retaliation, and the narrative that you can do this over and over again and it won't go south really quickly. But when we say that, the reaction from both Indian and Pakistani counterparts and analysts here is, shut the hell up, we're fine, So these are testable propositions. I think the risks are real, and downplaying the risks is a very dangerous game. And it may be that within the Indian Air Force, for example, they fully understand the risks, and I think they do. It's a very professional outfit. Whether they say so publicly or not about whether they understand the risks, I think there is an appreciation. When you look back at Balakot, do you really want to be getting in this game that often? Probably not. But there is this concern that it's not the nuclear weapons that are the problem here. It's Pakistan's sponsorship of terrorism, right? And then the risk is, let's be clear that that's the fundamental problem, right? We all agree with that. And then the question is, up until Balakot or the Uri attack, India basically took it. Vajpayee took it, Manmohan Singh took it, and Prime Minister Modi said, "I'm not going to take it anymore," which is also an understandable evolution also. And so then the risk that we see is, Pakistan does something stupid, and then India overreacts. And one lesson we have from the U.S., what has been the biggest downfall for the U.S. in the last 20 years? U.S. overreaction. Invading Iraq was an overreaction to 9/11 because it had nothing to do with 9/11. So the best prescription for long-term strategic success is to not overreact to problems. And I think that's a lesson learned from our mistakes. I think that's the simplest way I can put it.
I think we okay, last question because
you talked about the proposal that you and your colleagues put for the North Korean case. I was just wondering, is it moving away from the CVID?
Yeah, it's not CVID.
So in that sense, how politically it's been...
Well, no, hold on, let me be clear. So the proposal is, because you have to square the circle. Essentially, the proposal is a deal that is comprehensive in scope, that rhetorically sets CVID as the end point, but along the way has waypoints that focus on arms control, slowing the growth. First slow it, then cap it, and then you roll it. It's the same formula. This is a formula the U.S. has used forever today. Cap, roll back, and eliminate. I think you have to go slow, cap, roll back, and eliminate. You set those are the waypoints, but you know full well you're not going to get to roll back and elimination unless there's a regime change in Pyongyang. So the deal is comprehensive in scope. So politically, you say we are not accepting. Washington is allergic to accepting a new nuclear weapons power because they don't want to incentivize other countries to go get nuclear weapons, right? That's the reason why you can't accept it. So you have to set CVID as the end. I have no problem with that. But when you say you go to ratify the fiction of disarmament, Hanoi was going to be, haha, wink, nod, we'll keep it as the end point. But the things we're going to get are, let's slow the growth. Give me Yongbyon. Cap your ICBM force. And the number of nuclear weapons. And then we'll see what happens. That's basically the proposal. It has to be a deal that is comprehensive in scope, implemented in a step-by-step phase manner.
I think what Professor Naran's description is, many of us would agree, is the only way forward. Because the stated positions are too rigid and neither side is going to give up. So let us hope that the better sense prevails and two unpredictable leaders move in that direction. Please join me in giving a big thank you to us.
Thank you for having me.